A man's word was worth the land he stood on, but the land itself offered no promises. "Please, sir, is this not redemption?" The wind answered first, a low moan that stole the words from her mouth and threw them back as dust. It scoured the raw-planked platform, pulling at the hem of her thin wool coat and stinging the face of the small child huddled against her leg. The station master, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched against the prairie glare, barely looked up from his ledger. He grunted, a sound of pure indifference. He gestured with a thumb toward the faded sign swinging on one hinge. "Says so right there. Hope's Crossing. Redemption's another 30 miles east." He finally lifted his gaze, taking in her worn-out boots and the desperation clinging to her like the trail dust. "Train ain't stopping again till Thursday." The woman, Elara, felt the world tilt. The clapboard station, the endless expanse of brown grass, the pale, washed-out sky. It all swam for a moment. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, the small, warm anchor in a sea of cold emptiness. 30 miles. It might as well have been the moon. They had nothing but a single carpet bag and the last of a stale biscuit. Hope's Crossing. The name was a cruel joke, a final twist of a knife that had been turning for months. She had followed the letters, the careful instructions, the promise of a new life, and had failed at the final step. She had gotten off at the wrong station. From across the tracks, where a wagon was being loaded with sacks of flour and salt, a man watched. He did not stare, not in the way other men did. His gaze was steady and quiet, like the land itself. He was broad-shouldered, his face weathered into a map of sun and hardship, and he moved with an economy born of solitary work. He saw the woman's shoulders slump, a subtle collapse that spoke of a spirit worn down to its last thread. He saw the child, Lily, look up at her mother with wide, trusting eyes, oblivious to the chasm that had just opened at their feet. The station master turned and went back inside, the slam of his door a final, definitive punctuation. They were alone. The man, Silas, finished tying down the canvas over his wagon. He had seen women like her before, though usually they were just passing through, their faces pressed against the train window, looking out at his world as if it were a barren curiosity. This one was different. She was mired in it. He could feel her stillness, the heavy, leaden weight of a hope that had just died. He wasn't a man given to impulse. His life was a series of deliberate, repeated actions. Rise, work, eat, sleep. A fence of routine he had built around a hollow space in his heart. But the sight of the little girl, no bigger than a memory, tugged at something rusted shut inside him. The wind was picking up, carrying the sharp scent of a coming storm. It was a cold, wet one, the kind that could kill a stray calf or a person without shelter. He couldn't leave them there. He just couldn't. He walked across the tracks, his boots crunching on the gravel. Elara flinched as he approached, pulling Lily closer behind her skirt. She had learned to be wary of men, of their sudden kindnesses that always came with a price. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hat tipped low against the wind. He didn't look directly at her, but at the bruised purple horizon. "Storm's coming in," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, and used to forming words for others. "A bad one." Elara said nothing. She held herself rigid, a statue of exhausted pride. He cleared his throat. "You can't stay here. The station master locks up. There's nowhere to go." He finally looked at her, his eyes a pale, clear gray. They held no judgment, no pity, just a plain statement of fact. "I've got a place. It's warm. There's food." Her chin lifted. "We are waiting for someone." The lie was thin, brittle. Silas gave a slow nod, accepting the lie without challenging it. He knew no one was coming. No one ever came to Hope's Crossing for a woman and child standing alone on the platform. "He'll know to look for you at my place if he comes. It's the only homestead for 10 miles, he offered a reason, a way for her to accept without surrendering her dignity. Lily, who had been peering around her mother's skirt, took a tentative step forward, her eyes, wide and blue, fixed on the tall, quiet man. She had been told for weeks they were going to meet her new papa, a man who had a big house and would keep them safe. This man was big. He looked strong. In her simple, childish logic, the pieces fit together. A small, hopeful voice piped up, clear as a bell in the rising wind. "Papa?" she asked, her gaze full of unquestioning faith. "Papa, God finally answered us." The word struck Silas like a physical blow. It echoed in the vast, empty chambers of his memory. He froze, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He saw a flash of another small face, another time. The pain was so sharp, so sudden, he almost turned and walked away. But then he saw Ilara's expression. The horror, the shame, the desperate way she pulled her daughter back, whispering, "No, Lily, no, hush now." He saw the tears welling in the woman's eyes, not of sorrow, but of pure, crushing mortification. And in that moment, his own pain receded, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. He looked at the child, then at the mother, and the wall he had so carefully built around himself cracked. He simply couldn't leave them to the storm. He turned toward his wagon without another word, a silent invitation. After a long moment of wrestling with her pride and her fear, Ilara picked up their worn bag. She took Lily's hand. She followed. The wagon ride was a study in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wheels, the plodding of the horses, and the ceaseless complaint of the wind. Silas kept his eyes on the horizon, his shoulders set against the growing chill. Ilara sat huddled with Lily on the buckboard, pulling her own thin coat tighter around the child, who had quickly fallen asleep, lulled by the rhythmic jostling. Ilara watched the man's back. It was a wall broad and unreadable. She felt a tremor of fear, the familiar companion of her last few years. What had she done? She had put her and her daughter's fate into the hands of a complete stranger, a man of the wilderness who spoke in clipped sentences and whose eyes held a sorrow as vast as the plains they were crossing. But what choice had there been? The station, the cold, the coming storm. This was a chance, however slim. She had learned to measure life in chances, each one a gamble against a world that seemed determined to crush her. The man she was supposed to meet in redemption, Mr. Barrow, had promised security. His letters were full of stern but proper words about duty and a wife's place. It had sounded like a harbor, a place to finally stop running. Now that harbor was lost, and she was adrift with this silent, grim-faced stranger. The landscape was unforgiving. It rolled on in waves of dun and faded gold, broken only by weathered rock formations and the occasional skeletal tree. To Ilara, who had come from a place of green hills and crowded towns, it felt like the edge of the world. It was a place that could swallow a person whole, leaving no trace. Yet, the man beside her seemed a part of it. He navigated by instinct, his posture relaxed, his hands light on the reins. He belonged here. She and Lily were trespassers. As twilight bled across the sky, painting the undersides of the storm clouds in shades of lavender and bruised gray, a light appeared in the distance. A single, small point of yellow warmth in the immense darkness. As they drew closer, she could make out the shape of a cabin, low and solid, with a curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, a darker shape against the darkening land. There were no other signs of life, no other lights, no other roads, just this small, defiant outpost against the wilderness. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. "We're here." He got down and, without a word, came around to her side. He reached up, and for a terrifying second, Ilara thought he meant to grab her. Instead, his large, calloused hands went to the sleeping child. He lifted Lily from her arms as gently as if she were made of spun glass. The girl stirred, murmured something in her sleep, and settled against his broad chest, her small head tucked under his chin. The gesture was so paternal, so unexpectedly tender, that it disarmed Ilara completely. He carried the child inside, leaving Ilara to climb down from the wagon on her own, her legs stiff and cold. She followed him into the cabin, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dim light of a single kerosene lamp. The interior was one room, meticulously clean and sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of something simmering over the low flames. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was tucked into one corner, and a stack of neatly folded blankets sat on a wooden chest. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and solitude. It was the scent of a life lived entirely alone. Silas laid Lily down on his bed, pulling a thick wool blanket over her. He moved with a quiet efficiency that suggested long practice. He then turned to the fireplace, ladling a thick stew into 2 tin bowls. He placed them on the table and gestured for Ilara to sit. She remained by the door, clutching her bag. We don't want to be a burden. Eating's not a burden, he said, his back to her. It's a necessity. Sit. She hesitated, then slowly moved to the table, perching on the edge of the chair. The stew was rich with game meat and vegetables. It was hot and nourishing, and she realized she hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. She ate slowly, methodically, never taking her eyes off him. He ate quickly, his gaze fixed on his bowl. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence in the wagon. Here, it was filled with the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside, and the small, sleeping breaths of her daughter. When they were finished, he took her bowl and washed it in a basin with his own. He pointed to a small door in the corner. That's a small room. Cot in there. It's clean. He picked up a pile of blankets from the chest. I'll sleep by the fire. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she was from or why she was here. His offer of shelter was as plain and unadorned as the cabin itself. It asked for nothing in return. This lack of curiosity was both a comfort and a source of unease. It was as if their presence was a temporary condition, like the storm, something to be weathered and then forgotten. Ilara went to the small room. It was little more than a storage pantry, but it was clean, and a narrow cot with a thin mattress stood against one wall. It was more than they'd had in a long time. She took a spare blanket and went back to the main room. Silas was adding a log to the fire, his face illuminated by the sudden flare of embers. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes. She saw the profound weariness in his posture. She needs this more, Ilara said, holding out the blanket. The one on the bed is enough. He looked at the blanket, then at her. For the first time, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He took it with a nod. Thank you. She retreated to the small room and quietly wedged the back of a chair under the doorknob. It was a foolish gesture. If he meant them harm, a chair would not stop him, but it was a habit born of necessity. Lying on the cot, listening to the storm finally break outside, the rain lashing against the roof, Ilara felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in a long time, she and Lily were warm, fed, and under a solid roof. She did not trust the man, not yet, but she trusted the shelter he had given them. And for tonight that was enough. She drifted to sleep, the sound of the rain a lullaby, the image of a stranger's gentle hands lifting her child a final, confusing thought. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm, a routine built on silence and observation. Ilara would wake to find Silas already gone. A stack of freshly chopped wood left by the door and the embers in the fireplace stirred and waiting. She would fetch water from the well, the cold morning air sharp in her lungs. She would make a simple breakfast for herself and Lily, using the provisions he had laid out on the counter: a bag of flour, a slab of bacon, a small sack of dried apples. She spent her days exploring the confines of their new, temporary world. She swept the cabin until the floorboards shone. She mended their clothes with thread from her own bag, her stitches small and neat. She took Silas's work shirts, left in a pile by the door, and patched the elbows and reinforced the seams, a silent offering of her own. Lily, with the boundless resilience of a child, adapted quickly. The cabin became her kingdom. She would talk to the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, create families out of twigs and pebbles, and hum little songs to herself as she played by the hearth. She was wary of Silas, but her fear was tempered by a deep curiosity. She would watch him from the doorway when he returned at dusk, his face grimy with work, his movements slow and tired. He never spoke to her directly, but sometimes Alara would see him leave a curiously shaped stone or a bird's feather on the porch rail where he knew she would find it. Silas, for his part, maintained his distance. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences on the far side of his property, clearing brush, tending to his 2 horses and a handful of cattle. The physical labor was a balm, a familiar weight that kept the ghosts at bay. But the presence of the woman and child had irrevocably altered the texture of his solitude. He was no longer just alone. He was aware of his aloneness. When he returned to the cabin now, it smelled not just of smoke and leather, but of baking bread and something faintly floral from the soap Alara used. He would find his shirts mended, his supplies tidied, a quiet order imposed on his bachelor's existence. They ate their evening meals in the same consuming silence as the first night. The clink of cutlery against tin plates was the only conversation. Yet the silence was changing. It was less of an empty void and more of a shared space, filled with unspoken questions and observations. He noticed the way she always gave Lily the best portion of the meat. She noticed the way he always checked the woodbox was full before he settled in for the night. They were 2 strangers orbiting each other, their paths defined by the small, necessary tasks of survival. Trust had not yet taken root, but a fragile kind of mutual respect was beginning to sprout in the barren soil of their shared isolation. One afternoon, while exploring the corners of the main room, Lily discovered something tucked away behind a stack of old hides. It was a small wooden rocking chair, perfectly child-sized, covered in a thick layer of dust. "Mama, look!" she cried, her voice full of excitement. "A chair for me." She tried to pull it out, but Alara stopped her, her voice sharp. "Lily, no. Don't touch that. It's not yours." The chair was clearly old, but well-made. The wood was dark and smooth, and a simple carving of a star was etched into its back. It was a piece made with love, for a specific, beloved child. Alara understood instinctively that it was a relic, a piece of the man's sealed-off past. To touch it felt like a violation. She draped an old canvas sack back over it, hiding it from view. That evening, when Silas returned, he saw the corner of the rocker peeking out from under the canvas. He saw the faint footprints in the dust around it. His jaw tightened. He said nothing during dinner, his silence heavier, colder than before. Alara felt the shift, the return of the impenetrable wall. She had been right. They had trespassed. After Lily was asleep in the small room, Alara sat by the fire, her mending in her lap, her heart heavy with a familiar anxiety. She was waiting for him to tell them to leave. The storm had passed days ago. Their welcome, she was sure, had worn out. Silas sat staring into the flames, his big hands resting on his knees. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face. For a long time he didn't move. Then he stood up, walked to the corner, and pulled the canvas off the rocking chair. He took a rag from a nearby shelf and, with slow, deliberate movements, began to wipe away years of dust. He polished the wood until the carved star shone faintly in the firelight. He didn't look at Alara, but he spoke into the quiet room, his voice thick with unshed grief. "It was for my son," he said. His name was Thomas. He didn't say any more. He didn't need to. The 3 words hung in the air, explaining everything. The solitude, the sadness in his eyes, the hollow space he lived in. He finished cleaning the chair and then, instead of hiding it away again, he gently pushed it closer to the hearth, into the circle of warmth and light. It was a silent invitation, an offering. Alara's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the empty chair, a testament to a love that had nowhere to go, and her heart ached for this man she barely knew. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a single, sharp nod, his back still to her. He then picked up his blankets and settled by the fire as he always did, turning his face away from her and the small, empty chair that now held the weight of all their unspoken sorrows. The wall between them hadn't vanished, But a small gate had been opened, a gate of shared grief. The sky, which had been clear for a week, began to turn a sullen gray. A change was coming. Silas felt it in his bones, the way an old injury ached before a rain. The air grew heavy and still, the birds fell silent. He spent the day securing the barn and reinforcing a loose shutter on the cabin, his movements urgent. He brought in extra loads of firewood and buckets of water from the well, preparing for a siege. Inside, Alara felt the oppressive atmosphere too. She watched him work through the window, his broad back a bulwark against the threatening sky. Lily seemed to feel the change as well. She was listless, her usual playful chatter replaced by a fretful silence. By late afternoon, she was coughing, a dry, hacking sound that sent a spike of fear through Alara's heart. She put a hand to her daughter's forehead. It was hot to the touch. By the time Silas came in for the evening, the wind had begun to howl, and the first drops of icy rain were striking the roof like thrown pebbles. Lily was bundled in blankets by the fire, her breathing shallow, her cheeks flushed with fever. Alara was bathing her face with a cool cloth, her own face a mask of controlled panic. Silas took one look at the scene and his demeanor changed. The quiet, withdrawn man vanished, replaced by someone focused and competent. "Keep her warm," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But not too warm. Don't let the fever bake her." He went to a large wooden chest in the corner, one Alara had assumed held only old tools. He opened it, and she saw it was filled with dried herbs, roots, and bundled leaves, all carefully labeled. He pulled out several small pouches, his hands moving with a sureness that spoke of deep, perhaps painful, familiarity. He ground some leaves into a paste with a mortar and pestle, the sharp, medicinal scent filling the cabin. "Willow bark," he explained, seeing her watching him, "for the fever, and yarrow, to make her sweat it out." He mixed the herbs with hot water, creating a bitter-smelling tea. "Can you get her to drink this?" Alara nodded, her fear momentarily pushed aside by his calm authority. Together, they coaxed the hot liquid into the sick child. Lily whimpered and tried to turn away, but Silas spoke to her, his rough voice pitched low and soothing. "Just a little now. It'll make you feel better. I promise," to Alara's astonishment. Lily seemed to respond to the gentle rumble of his voice, swallowing a few sips before sinking back into a feverish sleep. The storm hit with full fury. Sleet and freezing rain battered the small cabin, and the wind shrieked like a hungry animal. The world outside was erased, leaving only the three of them in their small circle of lamplight, fighting a battle against an invisible enemy. For hours, Silas and Alara worked in tandem. He prepared poultices for Lily's chest and brewed more tea. She bathed the child's face, changed her sweat-soaked nightgown, and whispered words of comfort into her ear. They moved around each other in the small space, their previous awkwardness gone, replaced by a shared, desperate purpose. Sometime deep in the night, Lily began to toss and turn, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her fever was climbing. Alara felt a wave of helpless terror wash over her. They were alone, miles from any doctor, at the mercy of the storm and a child's fragile hold on life. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. Silas saw her despair. He came and stood beside her, placing a large, warm hand on her shoulder. "She's strong," he said, his voice a low anchor in the tempest of her fear. "She'll fight." He then did something that stunned her. He sat on the edge of the bed, gathered the sick child into his lap, and began to rock her gently, humming a tune that was tuneless but deeply comforting. He held her as if he had held a child 1,000 times before. He held her with a father's strength, a father's tenderness. He held her as if he were trying to pour his own life force into her small, struggling body. Alara watched him, her grief and fear mingling with a powerful, overwhelming sense of gratitude. In this harsh, solitary man, she saw a deep well of kindness he kept hidden from the world. She saw the ghost of the father he had been, the husband he had lost. She saw his pain and she saw his strength. The barricade she had kept around her own heart, the one built from years of hardship and mistrust, began to crumble. She pulled a chair close and sat beside them, resting her head against his arm, drawing strength from his solid presence. And together, they waited for the dawn, two strangers bound by the flickering life of a child, while the storm raged on outside. The fever broke just as the first pale light of morning seeped through the cabin window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and silent, draped in a thin blanket of ice. Lily's breathing eased, her skin grew cool to the touch, and she fell into a deep, healing sleep. The crisis was over. A profound exhaustion settled over the small cabin, so heavy it felt like a physical presence. Elara, slumped in the chair by the bed, felt as if she hadn't slept in a year. Silas rose stiffly from the bed, his joints protesting after a night spent in one position. He moved to the fireplace and quietly rebuilt the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. The shared ordeal had drained them both, but it had also forged a new connection between them, a bond tempered in the crucible of fear and sealed by the quiet miracle of a child's recovery. Elara followed him to the hearth. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice husky with emotion. "You saved her." Silas stared into the nascent flames, his face unreadable. "I didn't do much. She's a fighter," but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed the depth of his relief. He turned to look at her, and the usual guard was down from his eyes. She saw the raw emotion there, the memory of a time when his efforts had not been enough. "My son." His fever came on just as fast. The doctor was a day's ride away, and a blizzard had closed the pass. I used the same herbs, but it wasn't enough. The confession, stark and painful, hung between them in the quiet morning air. It was the key to the locked room of his past, offered to her without fanfare. Elara's heart went out to him. She could feel the shape of his loss, a wound that had never healed. "I'm so sorry, Silas," she said, using his name for the first time. "Felt right." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if to ward off any further pity. He went to the door and opened it, letting in a rush of frigid, clean air. The world outside glittered, every branch and blade of grass encased in a perfect, crystalline sheath of ice. It was beautiful and dangerous all at once. "The ice will melt by noon," he said, his voice back to its usual gruffness, the moment of vulnerability already being walled off again. "I need to check on the stock." He left, and Elara watched him go, a solid figure moving through a fragile, glittering world. When he was gone, she made coffee. When he returned an hour later, cold and weary, she handed him a hot tin cup without a word. He took it, his cold fingers brushing against hers. Their eyes met for a long moment over the steaming cup. It was a simple exchange, but it felt like a treaty, a silent acknowledgement that everything had changed. In the days that followed, the silence in the cabin became softer, more comfortable. It was no longer a space to be endured but a peace to be shared. Lily recovered her strength quickly, and her laughter once again filled the small room. She was no longer afraid of Silas. She would follow him out to the porch, chattering away to him as he mended a harness or sharpened an axe. He rarely answered in words, but he would listen, a small, almost imperceptible smile sometimes touching the corners of his mouth. One afternoon, he emerged from the barn carrying the small, dusty rocking chair. He placed it by the fire. "For Lily," he said to Elara, "it's time it was used." The gesture was monumental. He was not just giving Lily a chair. He was letting go of a piece of his grief. He was allowing a new life to inhabit the space left by the old one. That evening, as Lily rocked contentedly by the fire, humming to a doll Elara had fashioned from a corn husk, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. One evening, as they sat in their usual quiet, Elara found the courage to speak of her own past. She told him about her husband, a good man, a farmer, taken by pneumonia 2 winters ago. She told him about the debts, the loss of their farm, The desperate moved to the city where she found only grueling work in a laundry for pennies a day. She told him about the advertisement in a church paper for a wife for a rancher in a town called Redemption. It seemed like the only way out, she explained, her gaze fixed on her hands, twisting a loose thread on her apron. A chance for Lily to have a home, a father. Mr. Barrow's letters. They were not warm, but they were proper. He seemed respectable. She finally looked at Silas. I was a fool to believe a piece of paper. Silas listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. But she could feel his attention, a deep, powerful stillness that made her feel heard in a way she hadn't been in years. When she was finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and certain. You're not a fool, he said. You're a survivor. You did what you had to for your child. There's no shame in that. His words were a bomb on a wound she hadn't even realized was festering. He did not judge her. He did not pity her. He saw her strength. In that moment, the last of her fear of him withered away, replaced by a deep and abiding trust. She had gotten off at the wrong station, but she was beginning to think she had ended up in exactly the right place. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The harsh beauty of the plains became familiar. The rhythm of life on the homestead became her own. They needed supplies, things Alara couldn't make and Silas couldn't grow. The trip to Hope's Crossing was unavoidable. The thought of it filled Alara with a cold dread. The town was a link to the world she had fled, a place where her precarious new existence could be shattered. Silas seemed to understand her apprehension. We'll go in the morning, he said the night before. You and the girl stay in the wagon. I'll be quick. He was trying to protect her, to keep her invisible. But the world has a way of finding you. Hope's Crossing was little more than a dusty street lined with a half-dozen false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a smithy, and the train station. As Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the store, Alara kept her head down, pulling Lily closer to her. But as Silas was inside, a man on horseback rode into town, his clothes too fine, his posture too arrogant for the humble setting. He reined his horse in, his eyes scanning the street. They settled on the wagon, on the woman with the child. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He dismounted and strode toward them. Well, well, look what the wind blew in. Alara's blood ran cold. It was him, Mr. Barrow. He looked just as he had in the small photograph he'd sent. A sharp, ferret-like face, with small, intelligent eyes that held a glint of ownership. I believe you have something that belongs to me, he said, his voice loud enough for the few people on the street to hear. He reached for her arm. I paid your passage, madam. You are my property, in a manner of speaking. Alara recoiled, pulling her arm away. I am no one's property. Oh, I think you are, he sneered, his face darkening. You're a runaway, a thief. You took my money and then disappeared. I've been asking after you up and down this line. His gaze flickered to Lily. And with a child, no less. I was not told about a child. The door of the general store creaked open. Silas stepped out, a sack of flour on one shoulder. He took in the scene in an instant. The fancy, sneering man, Alara's terrified face, the man's hand reaching for her again. He dropped the sack with a heavy thud, sending up a cloud of white dust. He moved with a speed that was startling in such a large man. He didn't run. He simply covered the ground, planting himself directly between Barrow and Alara. He was a mountain of quiet fury. He was taller than Barrow, wider, and seemed rooted to the very earth. There's a mistake, Silas said, his voice dangerously low. Barrow looked Silas up and down with contempt. This is a private matter between me and my intended. Step aside, farmer. She is not your intended, Silas stated. It wasn't a question or an argument. It was a fact. I have the letters. I have the receipt for her ticket, Barrow blustered, his arrogance faltering slightly in the face of Silas's unyielding presence. She made an agreement. The few townspeople who had been milling about had stopped to watch the unfolding drama. Their faces were curious, expectant. Alara felt a wave of crushing humiliation. She was being displayed, her desperation laid bare for all to see. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every person on that street leaned in to hear his next words. He reached back, not looking at Alara, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture was protective, possessive, and utterly public. "The agreement's void," Silas said. His pale gray eyes locked on Barrow's. "She's chosen." The simple declaration silenced the street. It was an old-fashioned, frontier pronouncement. It was a claim. In 2 words, he had erased Barrow's legalistic arguments and replaced them with a moral one. He had drawn a line in the dust and placed Alara and Lily firmly on his side of it. He was not just offering shelter anymore. He was offering his name, his protection, his life. Barrow stared at Silas's stony face, at the unwavering hand on Alara's shoulder. He looked at the hard, weathered faces of the townspeople watching him. He was an outsider here, a man of contracts and money in a place where a man's character was the only real currency. He had lost. With a final, venomous glare, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of town without a backward glance. The ride back to the homestead was steeped in a new kind of silence. It was not the awkward silence of strangers, nor the comfortable silence of companions. It was a silence humming with the weight of what had just happened. Silas had made a public declaration. He had claimed them in front of the world. Alara sat beside him, her mind reeling. She kept replaying his words. She's chosen. He had given her a choice, a voice, even as he spoke for her. He hadn't said, "She's mine," he had said, "She's chosen." When they arrived back at the cabin, the familiar landscape seemed changed, imbued with a new sense of permanence. This was no longer just Silas's homestead. It was their sanctuary. He carried the supplies inside, moving with his usual quiet purpose, but something in his posture had shifted. The deep-seated weariness seemed to have lessened, replaced by a resolute strength. That evening, the routine was different. As Alara prepared dinner, she set 3 places at the small table. It was a simple act, but it was a profound acknowledgement of the change. When Silas came to eat, he didn't sit on his usual stool by the fire. He took the chair she had set for him at the table, across from her and Lily. They ate the meal together, a family. After dinner, while Alara washed the dishes, Lily, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, retrieved a piece of charcoal and a scrap of brown wrapping paper from the store. She sat on the floor by the fire, her small tongue stuck out in concentration as she drew. When she was finished, she walked solemnly over to Silas, who was cleaning a piece of tack. She held up the drawing. It was a child's simple, powerful art. A large, square house with a crooked chimney puffing out a spiral of smoke. In front of the house stood 3 figures. A very tall man, a woman with a triangle dress, and a tiny stick figure girl between them. The 3 figures were all holding hands. "This is for you," she said, her voice clear and certain. She pointed to the big figure. "That's you." Then she pointed to herself and her mother. "That's us." She looked up at his weathered face, her blue eyes shining with an unshakable faith. "This is our home now, Papa." The word, which had once struck him with such pain, now landed differently. It was not a mistake this time. It was a truth a child had recognized long before the adults had dared to name it. Silas looked down at the drawing, at the crude depiction of a family, of a home. A feeling he had thought long dead stirred in his chest. A warmth spread through him, chasing out the last of the cold shadows. He reached out a calloused, gentle hand and accepted the drawing. He looked at Lily, then at Alara, who was watching them with tears shimmering in her eyes. "Yes," Silas said, his voice thick. "Yes, it is." He tacked the drawing to the rough-hewn wall beside the fireplace. It was the only decoration in the entire cabin. It was enough. The seasons turned. The brilliant, fleeting green of spring gave way to the deep, sun-baked gold of summer, which in turn mellowed into the crisp, clear days of autumn. The rhythm of their lives settled, deepened. The cabin was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It was a vessel for their shared existence. Alara's touch was everywhere. Simple curtains, sewn from bleached flour sacks, now hung in the window, softening the harsh afternoon light. Wildflowers she and Lily gathered stood in a jar on the table. The sharp edges of Silas's solitude had been worn smooth by the steady, gentle friction of family. He taught her the ways of the land. He showed her which plants were for medicine and which for the stew pot. He taught her how to read the sky for weather, how to listen to the silence of the prairie and understand its language. She, in turn, brought a warmth and life to his home that he had forgotten was possible. The smell of baking bread became a constant, comforting presence. The sound of Lily's laughter was a song that echoed off the cabin walls, chasing away the ghosts of silence. They rarely spoke of the future. They didn't need to. It was being built each day in small, sturdy increments. It was in the way he started building a small addition onto the cabin, a proper room for Lily. It was in the way she planted a small garden, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the stubborn earth. It was in the way Lily's drawing remained on the wall, a cherished icon, a map of how they had come to be. One cool evening, with the first hint of winter in the air, Silas sat on the porch steps, oiling a leather bridle. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple across the vast horizon. The world was quiet, peaceful. Alara came out of the cabin, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and sat on the step beside him. She didn't speak, just sat with him, watching the day end. For a long time they watched in comfortable silence. The little wooden rocker, which now lived on the porch during the day, creaked faintly in the breeze. It was no longer a symbol of loss, but a testament to continuity, to the way life, if given a chance, will always find a way to fill the empty spaces. From silence had come a language, one spoken in shared work and quiet glances. From an empty cabin had come a home, built not with nails and timber, but with kindness and courage. From two broken people and one hopeful child had come something that looked and felt and breathed like love. Silas finished his work, setting the bridle aside. He flexed his large, stiff hands. Alara looked at those hands. She had seen them gentle a frightened horse, mend a broken fence, and tenderly soothe a child's fever. They were strong hands, capable hands. They were the hands of a good man. He turned his head and looked at her. His pale gray eyes, which had once held such profound sorrow, were now clear and calm. They reflected the endless sky, and in their depths, she saw her own reflection. She saw a woman who was no longer running, no longer afraid. A woman who had found her redemption not in a place on a map, but in the heart of a stranger. "The first snow will be here soon," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll need to mend your heavy coat," she replied. "The lining is torn." It was a simple, domestic exchange, a conversation about a coat, about the coming winter. But underneath it was a declaration. They were talking about a future together, a future of shared seasons, of weathering storms side by side. Later that night, the fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Lily was asleep in her cot, one small hand clutching the corn-husk doll. Silas sat in his chair, not reading, just watching the flames, his face peaceful in the flickering light. The cabin was warm and safe, a small island of light in the vast, dark prairie. Alara finished her mending. She folded the fabric and put her sewing basket away. She walked to the hook by the door where Silas's heavy sheepskin coat hung. It was a permanent fixture now, a symbol of his presence, his protection. She ran her hand over the worn wool, feeling the solid strength of it. It smelled of him, of wood smoke and cold, clean air. Smelled like home. She turned and walked back to the fireplace. Instead of taking her usual chair, she sank to the floor, resting on the warm hearthstones beside him. She leaned her head against his knee, a gesture of complete trust, of profound belonging. He was startled, his body tensing for a moment. Then he relaxed. He slowly lifted his hand from the arm of the chair and gently placed it on her hair, his fingers stroking the soft strands. She reached up, her smaller hand covering his. She felt the calluses, the strength, the warmth. She intertwined her fingers with his. He stayed. She stayed. The fire cast 3 long shadows on the wall, where only one had been for years.